now Professor Christou.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, from me as well. The speeches from my esteemed predecessors cover a lot of ground of what I might have said with respect to what the European Union does and how it sees its relationship with civil society, or the citizen, I would say more specifically. So I will shift the discussion back to civil society more specifically, and it actually helps the task of what I was asked to do here, which was to critique the relationship between the EU and civil society. So, you know, here we are in the house of the EU with a project funded by the EU, so no difficult job there to critique it. I will try to keep my discussion as unacademic as possible, but indulge me for a minute to go back to the beginning and try to define what we mean by civil society. There has been scholarly debate on what the definition of that term is from the time of Aristotle and the philosophical underpinnings of such a definition, but I will stick to one very specific element that I think circumscribes rather than defines civil society, which is civic participation. Civic, not political, as the major focus of the discussion by our MEP was. I will stick to the civic aspect of participation for good reason, I think, which is that civil society has a role to play, which is to supplement the state. If we had a perfect state, we would not need a civil society. If we had a state that provides public goods in perfection, that accounts for all issues of discrimination or any other social issue that we might find lacking in society, we would not feel the need to supplement it with the provision of something else. It is that thing that I call, in its totality, civil society. If I was to give it a better definition, it would be a loosely coordinated, because it's not uncoordinated, but definitely not organized, set of interests and inputs into the process of governance that aims to improve it in some specific ways. And we heard a lot about that from the perspective of the EU. The EU, I would say, as a kind of general statement in terms of its relation to civil society, places it within the context of transparency, within the context of the democratic deficit, of course, as we heard. So I see it more broadly as a consultative body, a relatively unorganized body, but a consultative body nonetheless, that provides input into the mechanisms of policy formation within the context of decision-making. In other words, to provide transparency to the decision-making process. Organically, I will not go into the initiatives like the ECI that were already mentioned. Organically, this is supposed to be accomplished through the European Economic and Social Committee and in its interaction with the liaison group, which is organized thematically. So there is organization on rural issues, on urban issues, on gender issues, and you see where I'm going with this. And of course, in accordance with Article 11 of the Lisbon Treaty, which also regulates the operation of the aforementioned ECI. So that is, in a nutshell, how the EU views civil society, as a body that will provide input into its own processes. If you go on to the various websites or look at the legislation and the directives and to try to pinpoint what are the goals of this relationship, let me give you what I consider to be the most general statement of that goal. It's for there to be better correspondence between the legislation of the EU, and here indeed I will agree it's very important that the Parliament is the most democratically legitimate body of decision-making within the EU, better correspondence of what it does to the realities on the ground, to the economic and social realities of the different member states, and of course of individual citizens. Second stated goal is the promotion of dialogue between the EU and whatever this thing is that we call civil society. And the third is the promotion of EU values, which is the point that Mr. Mavridis ended on, which I think is an interesting point to consider from the perspective of a critique, because it's a hierarchical point. It's a top-down approach whereby the EU has some values and then it aims to promote them through its interaction and dialogue with civil society. But of course, civil society has values. That's one of the basic points of what civil society tries to do. So it ought to be at least a bi-directional relationship whereby civil society promotes its own values to the EU and not just the other way around. But also, how does it work? How does this relationship actually work from the perspective? So let me give you my critique in as short a time as possible. I believe the EU has its heart and mind in the right place. It aims to engage civil society. It aims to create, as I said, more transparency, more legitimacy, more accountability of decision makers to the citizen, more representativeness of the preferences of the civic body, and a narrowing of the democratic deficit. But I think there are some flaws in the logic of the actual application, if not the intent of this relationship of the EU to civil society. And let me make 5 brief points as to what those flaws are. The first is that accounting for civil society in a supranational political framework is quite different from a national context. So if you consider what civil society does here locally, is that it tries to advance some positions, raise awareness, change perhaps social values with respect to some historical traditions that perhaps ought to change. That is very difficult to accomplish within the context of a supranational framework, and I believe the tools that are in place are not really able to accomplish that anyway. You know, the major success story from the discussion here, I'm sure it's easy to see, is the ECI. But the ECI, what it does is try to create an agglomeration of all these interests on specific issues, of course, and then try to force the hand of the Commission in addressing those issues. But in a different national context, and of course there are many, there will be variation on those approaches. So one different aspect of thinking about a civil society in a supranational context would be to try to bring those in line. Now, partly that happens, as Luisa said at the very beginning, there are networks of NGOs that try to harmonize preferences on a national context to the European context. But there is very little in the framework of the European Union to help that aspect specifically. Secondly, one of the major issues that, as I already said, of what civil society wants to do is to change opinions, political views, social views, even moral views. And in that context, the relationship has to be much more of a grassroots rather than top-down approach, because that goal is not really to bolster democratic institutions. In other words, the goals of civil society are not to be found in Europe alone. They are to be found within themselves, and therefore they don't really need guidance in that respect. They ought to provide it. Thirdly, there is the issue of trying to put together civil societies of member states with vast variation in character, history, issues, and approaches to them in order to fit them within the context of what they're trying to do. I will just briefly mention, but leave aside, the issue of power relations, because if that is also taken into consideration, I think your example was very apropos of that, that it becomes increasingly difficult to see a way that, the way in which the EU actually facilitates, especially in small states, this major issue. And of course there is a glaring assumption here. I will actually end on this point with an additional example. The assumption is that there is a European civil society as there is a European polity. There might be one day, but I don't think that this day is that day. there are, as I said, networks, they create transnational links, but I think it is too much to ask in this stage, at this stage, the developmental stage of integration, to consider that civil society is a European body rather than a national context that may then be integrated into a European body. And as I said, I will end with an example of what I think is perhaps missing in the EU. Many of the issues that have been mentioned already and the ways in which, the mechanisms in which the EU operates have to do with funding. And they have to do with a design in the relationship that works in both ways, that funding works in the promotion of EU values, and then the grassroots approach is to inform EU decision-making. I see this not as civic participation and capacity building, even though it is also. This is mostly a tool of public diplomacy. If you consider the most successful, at least in my estimation, implementation of such a framework, it is the Fulbright program of the United States, where the vision is mostly the promotion of values and not the other way around. Yes, the European Union allows for the other side of the relationship to function, to inform the decision-making, but at the same time, it does not to a sufficient degree, I think, allow for the pollination, let's say, of the values of civil society to cross over to the EU on the basis of that relationship. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. At this point, we would welcome your questions. Mr. Andreas Socilos, please introduce yourself.
Yes.
I mean, the organization you represent.
Well, I represent here the Future World Center.
All right.
It's an NGO. My question is actually about the citizens' initiative in Cyprus about the legislation of the civil society organization. A group of organizations, as most of us know, have proposed a legislation, and the commissioner knows of this very well. He can let us know of the situation as to which is now. But what we hear is that it is blocked by the parties, by the political parties, because of them not understanding that there could be other organizations not politically oriented and have power and organization in the society. There is this resentment from the parliament. Now, the question is, can we use the facilities or the services of the European Union, because this is a citizens' initiative, although it is a national, can we use their services to support this initiative and actually make some comments to our parliament? This is one question. And the question again is to the Council of Europe, if that is a better institution to which we could ask for help.
So, who wants to answer this question?
I can have a very quick, small contribution. Perhaps Mr. Mavridis may want to say something. I mean, from our point of view, we should be very clear that we operate in a very well-defined institutional framework. You asked me whether we can support or you didn't say that, but this is what I understood, how to intervene in favor of your proposal. No, the position is very clear. The European Commission proposes, the European Parliament, together with the Council, decide on most things now, and as Mr. Mavridis was saying, that the powers of the Parliament have been reinforced. And then the Commission has the responsibility and the obligation, the duty, as we call it, the guardian of the treaties, to make sure that what the Council and the Parliament have decided, that is actually implemented. So, if it is a piece of legislation that is missing, if it is a piece of legislation, what you were referring to, at the European level, European legislation that is missing in Cyprus. So you have something which has been decided at the European level, and it has to be, as we say in our technical jargon, transposed to become national legislation. So if it is missing, or if it is insufficiently implemented, then yes, the Commission in any case would approach the authorities, the government in Cyprus, and say, look, there is something which has not been transposed correctly. And we would not necessarily wait for an initiative by NGOs or for some information, although I must also say that in some cases, the information that we get from NGOs, from citizens, from complainants about inadequately transposed legislation from the European to the national level is very useful for the Commission to know that something has not been done correctly in a member state. But this, as far as we're concerned, as far as the Commission is concerned, only applies to legislation which is either insufficiently or incorrectly transposed or not transposed at all. On anything else, we do not have the capacity to go and say, look, we're in favor of this, we're in favor of that. Having said this, it has been the case that in several member states that when we get information or when they inform the Commission that these proposals have taken place, I'm not 100% sure that I'm on the same wavelength as Professor Christou, or whether I understood correctly what you were saying, that there is a bidirectional process. It is not only the ECSC, the Economic and Social Committee, the Commission, and we know that, has regular interaction with citizens, whether we call them citizens or organized civil society. We can discuss about that, but on major proposals, we use the tool of the green paper very, very often, which basically is a consultation before the Commission proposes something to the Parliament and the Council for decision. We want to hear how organized groupings, legitimate groupings, interest groupings that on a specific proposal, or simple citizens, they have the right to go in the platform and say, this is my view on these things. So I don't know if, from the Commission's point of view, I explained what the process is, only if it is a question of incomplete, to use the word, transposition, application of European law, then we have the right.
Would you like to add?
Yes, I just want to have a very short comment to Andreas. But before that, before my comment, which, by the way, I was fully covered with what has already been said, did you mention, we are discussing now not the substance, but we are discussing the process. Did you mention going to the European Council or to the Council of Europe?
The Council of Europe is another institution.
Okay.
Possibly
Yes.
more appropriate for this, for democracy.
Okay. To my understanding, and maybe I'm not ready to discuss fully what going to the Council of Europe. To my understanding, the European Commission might be in the best place to submit your initiative, and the European Parliament. Of course, going through the European, and the other option that you might have, if you may want to choose it, is perhaps through the legal system. There is the Court of the European Union, which supposedly can discuss the lack of or the inadequate application of European values and principles and law.
Well, because it's...
Now, as far as the parties in
The-
Cyprus, I don't know.
No, the question is that the initiative it's in the Parliament now. It's been discussed.
Yes.
So actually, we need an intervention to this process of discussing something in the Parliament, which is not getting anywhere, like everything else.
No, that was
I don't know the reason why, though. I'm not ready to answer that. I'm not.
Hi. Thank you for all your speeches. They were very, very interesting and also very complimentary. I wanted to, I don't really know where to start actually, but I wanted to pick up on some of the things that Odysseas had brought up. And mainly what triggered me to want to speak was the question of, there's two issues. One is, because I agree with most of what you said, especially coming from, we have hands-on experience, so you kind of described very well the kind of challenges that civil society faces in its engagement with EU institutions. But what triggered my wanting to comment was, do we have an EU civil society? And I would say we do have an EU civil society. And what I wanted to ask you is how would you define it? How are you defining an EU civil society when you say that it doesn't exist? I have an idea of what you were getting at, but my question would be, after you tell us how you define it. If it's how I imagine it, I would say that perhaps we don't want that. Because in the same way that EU citizens are not a homogeneous group, that member states are not, and I feel that, which I'll be talking about later, but with our engagement with organizations from other member states, which is quite intense and regular, we have to be able to pick and choose when we coordinate, because we're not a homogeneous group. And in fact, there are, for example, in terms of feminist groups and the feminist movement in Europe, we have some major disagreements. And you might say that there are camps and so on. I mean, and I think that's healthy. And so I cannot imagine there being some kind of organic or homogeneous EU civil society. But I see it thriving. It has its challenges, and I pick, and I'm thinking very much on some of the issues that you raised on, for example, funding, and how priorities often are, we have to work within the priorities of the European Union rather than us influencing what those priorities are going to be. So sometimes what we feel needs to be done on the ground is not reflected when we get these calls for proposals and we see what the priorities are. We're just saying, are you kidding me? But at the same time, we have very creative ways of, kind of restructuring things and doing what we want and what we think needs to be done. And I just want to give one example, because it's very true that there are regular consultations issued by the European Commission where I was going to speak about this later, but never mind, where we are able to put down our views on specific issues. One, for example, I remember, but it doesn't mean that we're always successful, and it doesn't always mean that the results of those consultations actually translate into the Commission doing something. And I'm thinking of one example in particular was when civil society pushed for an EU strategy on violence against women, where right now there is no EU legislation on violence against women. This is the number one priority for the women's movement in Europe. And for years, we've been asking for an EU strategy on violence against women that would help coordinate policies across Europe. There was a consultation. The mobilization of women's organizations across Europe was unbelievable, where we coordinated what our answers were going to be. We knew exactly what we wanted. It came down centrally. We informed, this was through the European Women's Lobby specifically. I know that there was a strong desire and demand for it. After the consultation, we decided not to go ahead. We can't really explain why and so on. But the demand was there. The consultation was there, but it didn't translate into actual policy action for whatever reason. I just wanted to share that with you as well.
Should I respond?
To the first part of the question, your definition.
Yes, but there's also a point made that I don't want to overstate the point that there are no mechanisms and no channels of communication. That's not my point. My point is that I actually what you said, that the end result, if the goal of civil society is to fill the lacunas in legislation, should be that. It should be the same in a national context, in a supranational context, in all cases, if that goal is to be fulfilled. Now, with respect to homogeneity versus heterogeneity, again, I don't want to overstate the point that what we ought to be looking for is a homogeneous European civil society that approximates a national context. Even if we compare it to a federal state, to the degree that a supranational framework, looks like or perhaps is getting to an approximation of that, the interests of Hawaii and Alaska and Texas are not the same. Therefore, why would we expect that the interest of a much looser confederation we would want that to be the case? So I'm not saying that. And at the same time, however, I think there ought to be, and we're getting there, I think you would agree with me that we're getting there, better coordination on creating some subset on which European civil society agrees. In other words, not a homogeneity that creates an army of European states with no deviation from some core, but that circumscribes a common core that I think at this point it's more top-down than bottom-up. And I would, in a perfect world, I would like to see that change. That's my point.
Hello, my name is Viviane Petrescu. I'm a student at the University of Cyprus. And my question is how you think the EU can react on developments in the civil society that threaten the values of the EU. For example, far-right movements. I don't know how the situation is here on Cyprus, but I'm from Germany, and there it's a very dangerous development, and I see it happening in other member states of the EU as well. And I was wondering if you think that on the EU level there could be some kind of reaction to this.
I missed the word. What kind of movement?
Far-right movement. Like racist movements or...
Okay, am I on the spot? Not easy to answer it because it is a problem, and I would give you. I would try to be to present here the argument that the vast majority of the European Parliament will make, of course, because there are always exceptions to this. Well, there are legitimate concerns about the issues regarding the treatment of non-European citizens and the flanks of the inflow of, for example, the refugees, and whether they are refugees that are allowed to have an asylum in the European Union, or whether they are just seeking a better quality of life. And I don't want to discuss more about that, but there are, again, legitimate concerns, although I think that the Europe itself if I go to what I ended up my first intervention, that we have a core of basic values. And if you want to call up yourself a European citizen, I'm not looking on official statements and official documents. It's a matter of civilization. And to us, being Europeans, our civilization and our values and principles has no other way than to open up our arms and welcome all these people, and at the same time, we cannot accept far-right arguments which are very racist and xenophobic in nature. Again, there are legitimate concerns, but at the same time, there is a very different way of presenting and managing these issues. After all, we are managing people and not political indices or numbers. I try to be as generous and political as I could.
And Mr. Markopoulos would like to add something to
Yeah,
that.
just very quickly to say that in complement to what Mr. Mavridis said, the EU doesn't only have the set of values, it actually makes sure, because it is obliged to by the treaties, and I'm sorry for sounding so boring, but sometimes it is important to know that everything like that, everything we do, everything we say, is based on the rule of law, which has been agreed to by 28 member states that have voluntarily entered into this liaison. So we apply legislation. Our legislation derives from our values. We have, for example, anti-discrimination legislation. It is an offense. It is up to us as Europe, but it's also up to national authorities, in the first place, to apply this legislation and stop xenophobic actions, racist actions, especially when they involve either verbal or even worse, physical violence and all this kind of stuff. So the legislation is there. But I think, I don't want to take it too long, but I think also what is very important for Europe is to address the root causes of these problems. It is not just to say that if somebody utters a racist remark that he ends up in prison for 2 months, 3 months, 5 years, 10 years. It is to explain to people, to educate people, to involve people, because we have noticed that the most inclusive societies, they tend to have the less of these phenomena. The more affluent societies, they tend to have less of these phenomena. So our job is to raise the economic development of Europe, to include people, because the worst thing that can happen is that you have a marginalization. And then this is the ghettification of European society, either ghettos of immigrants or ghettos of extreme right and far right elements in society. So I think this is our job. Just one very, very quick comment before I forget about it, is that on the interaction between, because I heard it 2 or 3 times, and I also get paid from European taxpayers' money to defend the organization that I represent, you know, there is not a bidirectional, there is a monodirectional interaction between the Commission or EU and civil society. I don't think it is the case, and I want to refute that.
I didn't say that it's the case. I didn't say that it's the case. I said it's a bi-directional. I finished by saying in a perfect world, it would be more bottom-up.
Okay. So I take it, but I'm still going to say, so that I earn my salary, yes, what I was supposed to say, is that, I mean, in the EU, we have extremely high, we could have higher, but extremely high standards of transparency, both in the European Parliament and the European Commission. I dare say things that surpass the standards that exist in national, in member states. And this, to a very large extent, is due to pressure from civil society, who was saying, who is, I mean, not Mr. Markopoulos, because not that many people are interested in who I meet, but I mean, you know that commissioners, if they meet third-party interests, yes, they are obliged, Mr. Mavridis knows that, to put it in a public calendar. So, you know, they're legitimized to meet. I mean, they're not going to put it if a commissioner sees the MEP. They're not going to put it if they see a minister, because this is public authority. But if they see a third-party bona fide industry, lobbyist, relating to his or her area of activity, he or she, the commissioner, has to put it in a public calendar. I mean, that's just one of the examples. So we have very high standards, and these high standards, they have come. I mean, I've been in the European institutions for 29 years. They have come also to a large extent because of pressure from the European Parliament in the first instance. We must admit that, the political control that the European Parliament exercises on the executive, the Commission, but also, on top of that, from pressure from civil society organizations. We demand, you know, we need more transparency in all this. So just as an example to show that there is an interaction. It's not, but sorry, I misunderstood that you said that there was no, there is no lid.
May I make a small addition? That is an important one to the question raised. I agree with everything that Mr. Macron said in response to your question, and I think it's important not to deviate from that model. In fact, I think in that case, the model of the EU is much better than any alternative that we might come up with, and I think we must resist the temptation to think that we can legislate on a quasi-federal level political life in a national context. And in other words, if we are very clear on the boundaries of the law, on what falls outside of the law, exactly as you described, then we also describe what is permissible, and then we ought to allow that to take place. And there's always the fear that it could get out of hand, and then we must rely on the efficacy of both the political system and the legal system to exercise its role, rather than think that we can anticipate problems by perhaps legislating away the threat of the problem rather than the problem itself.
Hi. Thanks for your speeches, all of you. I would just want to make some point and ask you something. I'm not engaged directly in any NGO or CSO in Cyprus. I'm just a citizen, exactly. I studied international law, so I'm engaged more academically in what civil society is and what is the relationship with the authorities. So the first point I wanted to make is that I don't really believe in calling the values EU values. I think that those values that the civil societies are trying to enhance are more humane values than EU values. And there's a long history behind what is EU value and what is not, and how the EU countries try to enforce them in other countries. That's why I don't really like this term. The other thing is that, thank you for saying that civil society is civic participation, and that involves every citizen that is not organized in an NGO that is funded or anything. But my question, would be, don't you think that the European Central Bank is a public authority as well? Because we talked about power and the separation and the relationships between the institutions. Because I can see the European Central Bank acting as a public authority for the last minimum 5 years. And also, I can see a strong civil society those 5 years, calling for the stop of austerity, calling for more democratic legitimacy in the EU, and I cannot really see how the EU supports this, because we can say, yes, the EU supports the civil society organizations by funding, but if my dad gives me money, it doesn't mean that he gives me love. The same way, I don't see that just giving money and funding to the civil societies, you really support them. And I also want to hear what the European Parliament really thinks of the voices of the European citizens against actually the acts of the European Union, being the European Parliament or the Commission or the European Central Bank, which is my interest more. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I need to clarify something. When I speak of European values and principles, basically what I mean is what has already been mentioned in a very nice way. It's the rule of law of the European Union. And I'll give you a good example of that, a rule of law. Respecting the rule of law itself, it's a European value. It's a matter of civilization. And I will give you a good example from Cyprus. The respect of the right of property has to be a part of any solution as a rule. That's the European rule of law. And whether I am from Cyprus, an MEP from Cyprus, or an MEP from Germany, or Italy, or any other part of the European Union, it should make no difference. My disappointment, though, is that for some people, for some colleagues of mine, it makes a difference. You see my point, what disappoints me? The democratic rule, the freedom of expression. Let's talk about the recent elections we had in Turkey. I mean, I visited Turkey. There is, in any way you see it, those elections are not, of course, it's a matter of degree many times, but, and I have no way of, precise way of saying what is democratic and when something is not democratic. But I went to Turkey, and I can tell you that I visited Turkey, and I can tell you that following up the elections and having contact with many NGOs from Turkey, to me, to my understanding, this has been not a democratic result, because the freedom of expression, a European value, has been so much violated during the election campaign. So that's what I mean when I say values and principles, not something abstract and theoretical, but the rule of law.
They are not values by the meaning that they only correspond to EU citizens. I mean that they are humane values because they correspond to a citizen in Cyprus, but they correspond to a person in Saudi Arabia as well, and they correspond to a person in Turkey. That's what I mean.
And I agree.
And I agree with you as well. Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the most favored phrases for a politician is to say that the citizens agree with him. Okay, so to end up this discussion, I would say a few things about the European Central Bank. You see, any European Central Bank, any central bank, anywhere, it's in the place of critique, and many times, especially in times of financial crisis, the European Central Bank is in the middle of all this discussion and arguments. And having the experience in Cyprus of a bail-in, I understand why. We feel that we have been mistreated in a way which was not fair. But we can talk about this, and I can give you some explanations of why, or at least the perspective of the European Central Bank, why this happened to Cyprus. Their point in a nutshell is that there are common rules that everyone has to follow. And the rules, as long as they are agreed upon, they have to be followed. Yes.
Excuse me. Okay, a couple of last questions, I think.
Ah, okay. Please.
Thank you for...
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Avi. I'm representing Europe Direct Nicosia, but also the AHDR. It's based in the buffer zone just a few kilometers away. And I would like to thank you for all your speeches, particularly the professor. I thought it was very interesting. I wasn't going to say anything, but in light of the most recent comments, first of all, a note to the organizers. I think it would be lovely if questions could also be addressed in Turkish and future events, especially here at the EU House. And second of all, I don't see how what happens in Turkey is a violation of EU values, because Turkey is not in the EU. And I didn't understand that point. If it could be clarified, I'd really appreciate it. And I just didn't get the point overall. I mean, I didn't understand why, what the relevance of the recent Turkish elections was to this conversation and about democracy in Europe. And I also think that it was, I mean, speaking to NGOs maybe isn't the best way of judging what happened there. And there's other perspectives that could be taken into account.
Right. I was responding to a question about the values and principles of the European Union, or the rule of law of the European Union, being applied not only to the European citizens, but outside. So in that way, Turkey is not part of the European Union. At the same time, it's in an accession regime, it's an accession process. And that's why there are certain rules, the rule of law, that these members in the accession process have to obey. One of them is the freedom of expression. I don't need to say much of that. It's obvious that we have a different perspective, and it's okay to disagree. But I can tell you so many things that I have seen happening in Turkey the last few months against political opponents, which were in any, if we see them based on the rule of law of the European Union, are not democratically accepted. It's as simple as that. It's okay to disagree, but I have my point of view.
I don't necessarily have a different point of view. My question was about the relevance. Now I understand, and thanks for your explanation.
Good.
I just want to make a point of order on this, because I heard something which is very dear to my heart about the Turkish thing. To my knowledge, we didn't have a Greek interpretation here. So the language of this meeting was in English. And you know, we go out of our way in the EU House to, when it's possible, to have interpretation in both. Sometimes it's very expensive and very difficult to do because it requires very elaborate combinations of languages. So if perhaps we can say that the contribution that the European Commission does to the center can support us back in order to have more interpretation in Turkish when necessary. If that, but we must be. I'm sorry about this technical point, but it is very important. This meeting has been conducted in English.
Okay, last question.
My name is Petros Irakleous, and I represent KISA. For people that don't know, KISA is an NGO defending human rights, and particularly the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and victims of trafficking. KISA is very active in local and European level. We believe that decisions are not taken exclusively in Nicosia or even in Brussels. That's why, working in this parallel level, we are trying to have the maximum impact. So my question is, in KISA regularly we submit complaints to the EU Commission when the Cyprus state fails to respect the human rights particularly. To Mr. Macrobouliotis, whether you believe that there is an effective mechanism for forced, in a way, the state to respect the EU acquis. And to Mr. Mavridis, so it's fine. I mean, we have all the time to condemn Turkey for violating the human rights, but as the representative of Cypriots in the parliament, whether there is a mechanism to contempt, in a way, the Cyprus when fails to respect the human rights in Cyprus.
Shall I go very, very quickly first? Yes, of course there are mechanisms. I mean, there is law. If Cyprus, Greece, Germany, the UK, or whoever it is out of the 28 breaks or does not apply correctly EU law, then we have a very elaborate system by which, first of all, we try to solve the problem amicably, because our business is not to be in court every day, in the European court. Our business is to try and solve problems. If the problem doesn't get solved, we have what we call an infringement procedure. We open up a more formal discussion in a legal framework, and if this does not have a happy ending, then we take the member state to the Court of Justice. And we make sure that we enforce the application of the legislation. Now, sometimes certain organizations, not in Cyprus, I mean everywhere, they have another interpretation of what the law should look like. That also can be sorted out. There is one interpretation for us of European law, how it has to be applied. And in particular with KISA, you know, there are mechanisms, but also there are informal ones. Commissioner Avramopoulos, when he was last here in Cyprus, he saw KISA, and he had first-hand information. So there is also that kind of proximity between the top layers of political decision-making in the Commission and NGOs. But yes, there is a formal way of actually making sure that legislation is applied. That's what we're there for.
A very short comment to Petros. Whether I agree or not agree with GISA, it makes no difference. I'm always a strong supporter of the rule of law of the European Union, even for those things that I might differentiate myself. And I will give you a good example of that. You should show some understanding in the fact that I cannot be involved in all issues at the European level, and I'm not much involved in the refugees issues and the political asylum issues. But at the very beginning of my intervention, maybe you were here from the very beginning? Okay, then you should remember that for years, even before becoming a member of the European Parliament, I argued, perhaps sometimes I was the only one arguing at the time. Now I'm much more stronger, my voice, against the government of Cyprus for applying the European directives and the European law with regards to the protection of the European citizens, the Cyprus citizens, against the banking system. And I'm referring, this is not a political issue, I've been arguing for years, it's a matter of applying correctly the rule of law of the European Union. Banks in Cyprus have been using systematically unfair clauses in their contract agreements and also unfair practices.
At this point, we're going to conclude. I wanted to leave you with a comment. Even if we do not agree to the extent to which this is the case, it seems that we all share the opinion that civil society provides a necessary connection between the European institutions and the European citizens. Thank you all for your contribution today. Thank you. And now we are going to have a coffee break, and we are going to come back for the second part of the discussion, which is going to have more practical examples. Please stay with us for the second part of the debate.